Great. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. So again, welcome. We are recording today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for factors that influence pathogen growth. This is the second webinar in the series Food Safety Foundations. Last month in January, we discussed how food can become contaminated and 9 pathogens that cause foodborne illness. If you were unable to join us, Rick is going to share a link in the chat to the recorded webinar. So I'm Amy Johnston, I'm today's speaker. I'm a regional educator with University of Minnesota Extension on our food systems team working in food safety. Just a little bit about me. I earned a bachelor's of science from Michigan in dietetics and from Michigan State University, and a master's of science in public health nutrition from Case Western Reserve University. I'm a certified food protection manager, a certified HACCP and GMP for food processors and manufacturers, and have completed a variety of other specialized food safety trainings. Also with us today is Rick Meyer, who is here to assist with any technical difficulties. You can direct message Rick in the chat if you're experiencing any problems. He'll also be sharing links and information throughout the chat or throughout the webinar, and will also help monitor the chat for any questions. So the topics we'll be covering today include a brief recap of the pathogens we discussed in the January webinar. We'll dive into what pathogens need to grow and how your actions can control this growth. We'll spend some time discussing hand washing, since it is the best way to prevent the spread of pathogens. And lastly, we'll talk about how and why to prevent bare hand contact with food. So whether you're joining us to benefit your food business or you just want to learn more, I hope you leave this webinar with increased confidence in your ability to prevent foodborne illness. At the end of this webinar, you will know what pathogens need to grow to be able to grow and multiply on foods. You'll know how your actions can prevent pathogens from growing, have increased awareness about when and how to wash your hands when handling foods. And lastly, be able to use other tools or strategies like tongs or disposable single-use gloves to handle foods instead of bare hands. Everyone has the ability to minimize the risk of foodborne illness through safe handling of foods. So as a reminder, in January, we defined handling of food to include any time you are touching the raw ingredients or a prepared food product. Handling includes harvesting, packaging it for transportation, unloading and storing, washing, preparing, packaging for sale, and serving. So let's just dive in. To recap, what are pathogens? Pathogens are biological hazards which cause illness when eaten. Biological hazards are one of the 3 hazard types that can cause foodborne illness or injury when consumed. The other 2 hazards are physical and chemical. These illness-causing microorganisms are bacteria, viruses, molds, yeasts, and fungi. There's over 31 pathogens known to cause foodborne illness. Symptoms of foodborne illness can include nausea or upset stomach, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, headache, body aches, fatigue, and vision problems. Some of these pathogens are found in the soil or the environment, others in the gastrointestinal tracts of animals and birds, and can contaminate foods during growing, harvesting, or processing. And other pathogens are spread from an infected person to foods. In January, we reviewed 9 of the 31 known pathogens to cause foodborne illness, as these 9 are frequent causes of foodborne illness and outbreaks. So we discussed norovirus, the hepatitis A virus, salmonella, campylobacter, Shiga toxin producing E. coli, Listeria monocytogenes, Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium perfringens, and Staphylococcus aureus. So before we talk about what pathogens need to grow, let's watch a short video about how pathogens grow. This is a fun video from Michigan State University Extension.
Most people don't realize just how small bacteria really are. In fact, over 500,000 bacteria can fit on the point of a pin. Most people may only need to eat about 1,000 of some disease-causing bacteria to make them sick. This means you could make 500 people sick with what can fit on that pinpoint. Unlike a lot of other things that make people sick, bacteria can reproduce and grow out in the environment. Bacteria reproduce by splitting in half. This kind of reproduction can make a small problem very large very quickly. Let's imagine we have 5 bacteria that reproduce every 15 minutes. After 30 minutes, the colony of bacteria would be 20 bacteria large. After 1 hour, there would be 80 bacteria. Another half hour would grow the population to 320 bacteria. After a total of 2 hours, 1,280 bacteria would have formed. You can see how fast a problem can grow in the right circumstances.
So pathogens, specifically bacteria, can double in their number every 20 minutes if the conditions are right. So as the video showed, within a short period of time, the amount of bacteria present could increase to an amount that can make a lot of people sick. So there are 6 factors that impact how pathogens grow. These are food, oxygen, pH or acidity, moisture or water activity, time, and temperature. So over the next several minutes, we'll talk about how each of these factors can promote or deter pathogen growth and strategies you can use to prevent the growth. It's important to note that viruses, a type of pathogen, do not necessarily require these same factors for growth, as viruses are able to live on hard surfaces for different amounts of time. These factors can greatly impact the growth of bacteria, molds, yeasts, and fungi. So pathogens such as bacteria, molds, yeasts, and fungi all need a food source in order to grow and multiply. Just as we humans require an energy source or fuel, so do these microorganisms. Proteins and carbohydrates are a good food source for these pathogens because they contain carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients that the pathogens need for cellular growth. Some foods, like certain fruits and vegetables with a thick peel or a rind, have a natural barrier that can help prevent pathogens from getting to that fleshy inside that's rich in carbohydrates and nutrients. However, once that produce is cut, any pathogens that were left on the outside, if washing wasn't enough, or if new pathogens contaminated it, they could have easy access to that food source. Another example is a package of baked treats that were handled by somebody who was sick, and they contaminated the outside of the packaging. They sell that package of food. Then the person who opens that package, touches the food, has the potential to now spread those pathogens to the food. So once a pathogen has contaminated a food, it has free access to those nutrients it needs to grow. So preventing the contamination is critical. You can minimize the risk of pathogens contaminating a food and using that food as a source or a fuel for growth by thoroughly washing produce before preparing, even if it's going to be cooked. Prevent cross-contamination by using clean and sanitized food-grade storage containers for foods. Prevent cross-contamination by using separate cutting boards and utensils when preparing raw and ready-to-eat foods. So for example, using one cutting board and knife to cut raw poultry or meat, and another clean and sanitized cutting board and knife to cut vegetables. Oops, sorry about that. Store foods in an appropriate order in the refrigerator and freezer to prevent spills or drips from contaminating foods that might be cooked at a lower temperature. And keep foods covered or wrapped during storage and transport. Lastly, keep the food preparation areas clean to eliminate any pathogens that enter the space. Keep them from having access to a food source. So a reminder, our March webinar is going to focus on cleaning and sanitizing best practices. And again, just remember, viruses do not or may not need this food source to grow. The food is a vehicle to transport a virus when it's involved in foodborne illness. So preventing that spread of contamination is really essential to food safety. The presence or the availability of oxygen also impacts the survival and growth of pathogens. Many pathogens need a certain level of oxygen to survive and grow. Oxygen is needed for the process that break down food and nutrients into energy, and that process is called an aerobic metabolism or aerobic process. There are other pathogens that can survive or grow in anaerobic environments. An anaerobic environment is without or with very little oxygen. Examples of this are canned or bottled foods, vacuum sealed or reduced oxygen packaged foods. Pathogens switch to a different process to make energy from the nutrients in an anaerobic environment. Last month, 7 of the 9 pathogens we discussed were bacteria. Clostridium botulinum and Clostridium perfringens are 2 anaerobic bacteria, meaning the spores can survive in environments or food packages with little or no oxygen. 4 of the pathogens we discussed are called facultative anaerobic bacteria, and this means that they can survive in environments with or without oxygen by switching metabolic processes. And then last month, we also talked about Campylobacter. And Campylobacter is an aerobic bacteria, meaning it needs oxygen. And I mentioned these differences. It's not important to remember the exact names, but I mentioned this to highlight how important it is to minimize the risk of contamination because so many pathogens can adapt to their environments. So using safe food handling practices to prevent cross-contamination is very important. When processing or packaging foods into an anaerobic environment, follow the proper guidelines and procedures. The acidity of a food or the environment also impacts if a pathogen can survive or grow. pH is the measurement of acidity of a food. pH stands for potential of hydrogen. The pH or acidity is determined by the number of active hydrogen ions in that food. And we'll go over some examples in the next few minutes. The pH scale is from 0 to 14. 0 is the most acidic, 7 is neutral, so think distilled water. And then 14 is the least acidic. You may have heard terms like basic or alkaline. Those are in that 12, 13, 14 range. Acidic or acidified foods have a pH of 4.6 or less. An acidified food is a food that by itself may not have a pH of 4.6 or less, so ingredients with a lower pH are added to it. An example of an acidified food is pickled vegetables. So vinegar with 5% acetic acid is added to vegetables, and after a certain amount of time, an equilibrium pH is reached. This means that the acid has moved into the cells of the vegetables, so both the vegetables and the liquid are at the same pH. Pickled cucumbers, onions, carrots, and green beans are examples of some of these acidified foods. Fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, and yogurts are acidic foods. And certain fruits like citrus, apples, cherries, pineapples, and others are acidic as well. In the chat, Rick is sharing a reference chart from Clemson University that has the pH of many common foods for your reference. Low acid foods have a pH greater than 4.6. So vegetables without vinegar or other acidic ingredients added to them are low acid foods. Protein-rich foods like meats, poultry, fish, eggs, milk, tofu, beans, those are all low acid foods. Tomatoes can be tricky because some varieties might have a pH of 4.6 or less, and others might have a higher pH. Okay, so what does this have to do with pathogens? When we're talking about acidity and pathogen survival or growth, pathogens are organized into 3 groups. There are acidophiles, neutrophiles, and alkylophiles. Alkylophiles survive and grow in environments that have a pH of greater than 7. They do really good in pHs of 8.5 or above. None of the pathogens that we discussed in January are alkylophiles. Neutrophiles survive and grow in environments in a neutral pH range. So 5 to 8 is what they really like. The pathogens we discussed in January are neutrophiles, which is one of the reasons that they can be associated with certain foods and foodborne illness outbreaks. And acidophiles survive and grow in acidic environments, or a pH of 5.5 or less. There are strains of E. coli that can survive in acidic environments. Remember, there's over 700 types of E. coli. Bacillus bacteria are acidophiles, so think of bacteria that are important in fermentation and some involved in gut health. There's also fungi that can survive in slightly acidic environments. And again, I mentioned these different categories so you can see why the pH of 4.6 was identified as the maximum pH for acidic or acidified foods for food safety. At this pH or below, nucleophile or alkalophile bacteria are destroyed by a process called denaturing. The proteins in the bacteria are sensitive to the acid, meaning the hydrogen ions cannot bond or behave as they normally would, and this causes the physical structure of the bacteria to change. So the addition of acid lowers the pH and can destroy some bacteria. So you can add acidic ingredients to low acid foods to change the pH. Use tested standardized recipes for food preservation. Measure the final equilibrium pH of new recipes where you don't have that verification, and process low acid foods properly. Pathogens also need moisture or water to grow and survive. How easily pathogens can get the water for growth is impacted by the water activity of that food. Water activity is the ability of free water molecules to bind with other molecules. These other molecules can be sugars or proteins in foods, or they can also, the other molecules can be pathogens. Water activity is determined by measuring the equilibrium relative humidity of a food in an enclosed airtight container. The percent relative humidity is then divided by 100 to get a decimal, which is the water activity value. So the water activity scale, which you can see, goes from 0 to 1. Foods with a water activity closer to 1, so above 0.85, are moist foods, and drier foods have a water activity less than that. Research and testing has shown that foodborne illness-causing bacteria will have a very hard time growing or will not grow on foods with a water activity of 0.85 or less. So it's important to note that if a food with a water activity of 0.85 or less becomes contaminated with a bacteria, that lower water activity won't destroy any bacteria that contaminates the food, but that bacteria is going to be prevented from growing or multiplying because it'll have a hard time getting access to the water. Also of note, there are molds and yeasts that can grow in foods with a water activity between 0.6 and 0.75, which there are some different requirements for grains. So it's easy to recognize many foods that have a water activity of 0.85 or less, like dried fruit, dried herbs, dry or crunchy snack foods like chips, pretzels, crispy baked items, and cereals. These foods have all been cooked, baked, or dried so that the water, or the majority of the water, has been evaporated or removed from those foods. For those of you who make jams and jellies, you may know that these products have a water activity of 0.85 or less. By boiling to reduce the amount of water in the mixture, or by the addition of sugar and or pectin to the mixture, those are ways that you can reach that water activity of 0.85 or less. So boiling causes water to evaporate, decreasing the number of water molecules that are in the mixture. Water likes to bind with sugar. The reduced number of water molecules because of the boiling will bind with the sugar that's naturally present, or if you're adding sugar. And then pectin. Pectin is a starch that's naturally present in some foods, but then can also be added to jams and jellies during the cooking process. Water molecules will readily bind with the pectin and form a gel. So all of these decrease the ability of water molecules to be available for pathogens. It can be difficult to identify semi-moist foods that still have a water activity of 0.85 or less, because these foods might have a moist crumb, a chewy texture, or a velvety mouthfeel. And we want these foods to be moist because we want to enjoy them. These foods can be cakes, chewy cookies, breads, other baked goods, caramels, and other confections, just to name a few examples. So if these foods are not prepared properly, and the desired water activity of 0.85 or less is not achieved, and then these foods are held at room temperature. If it is contaminated, those pathogens will be able to bind with water that's present and potentially grow and multiply. So to control moisture, thoroughly dry or dehydrate foods, follow tested standardized recipes when making shelf-stable baked goods, measure the final product water activity of new recipes. If you need to lower the water activity, start with adjusting the baking or the cooking time. You can look at changing the amount or the type of sweetener you're using. Curing foods with salt will help draw out water molecules, and store foods in appropriate containers and non-permeable packaging to prevent moisture from entering that space. Temperature plays a critical role in pathogen growth. Cooking foods to the appropriate minimum internal temperature kills pathogens and can inactivate toxins produced by certain bacteria. During the January webinar, we reviewed the temperatures to cook foods to destroy certain pathogens. Cooking or heating of food is a very effective way to minimize the risk of foodborne illness. However, once cooked or heated, safe food handling practices to prevent new contamination must be used. Okay, so let's switch back to temperature. So hold foods at 135 degrees Fahrenheit or above to reduce the ability of any remaining pathogens to grow. Cool hot foods quickly as possible to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. When preparing cold foods, pre-chill your ingredients and then cool that final product quickly after preparing. And so all of these strategies are to minimize the time food spends in the temperature danger zone. So the temperature danger zone is the temperature range between 41 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit that is ideal for rapid pathogen growth. That is their sweet spot. So safely cooling foods is an important step in minimizing the risk of foodborne illness. As we discussed in January, pathogens like Clostridium perfringens can grow very easily in contaminated, improperly cooled foods. So cool hot foods from 135 degrees Fahrenheit or above down to 70 degrees within 2 hours, and then continue to cool to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below within the next 4 hours, or as quickly as possible. Cool, like room temperature foods or foods that were cold to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below within 4 hours. Cooling strategies can include an ice bath, dividing the food product into smaller quantities, or if you're in a fancy kitchen and you have a blast chiller, that's a great tool to use. So refrigerating or freezing does not kill any pathogens that may be present on the food. Refrigerating or freezing only stops the growth of the pathogens. And unfortunately, there are pathogens that can continue to grow at refrigerated temperatures. Listeria monocytogenes can survive and grow in temperatures as low as 34 degrees Fahrenheit. And Staphylococcus aureus can continue to grow at temperatures as low as 44 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you remember back to the January webinar, S. aureus is frequently linked to foods that require a lot of handling and need cold holding. So chicken or tuna salads, potato salads, egg salads, those cream-filled pastries. So if the refrigerator is not consistently at 41 degrees or below, or maybe these foods are stored in parts of the refrigerator that just can experience a temperature fluctuation, like right by the door. If that food is contaminated, the pathogen could continue to grow. So temperature control is all about minimizing the time foods are in that temperature danger zone. Again, the temperature danger zone is between 41 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit. That's that sweet spot for pathogens. When preserving foods, follow processing instructions for canning and other methods like dehydrating. Okay, so as we heard in the video at the beginning of the webinar, as time increases, so will the number of bacteria if the conditions are right. So far, we've discussed 5 factors that influence pathogen growth. Controlling as many of these 5 factors and controlling the amount of time a contaminated food is in its ideal environment is essential for preventing growth and minimizing the risk of foodborne illness. So this is a bacteria growth chart. And while the amount of time and the number of bacteria will vary depending on a specific pathogen and what other factors are being controlled, it's the shape that's important and that we're using as a visual. So the first phase in bacteria growth is called the lag phase. A lag phase is when bacteria are adapting to their environment and they're preparing to grow, or maybe there could be some minimal or slow growth occurring. This phase can last an hour to several days, depending on the bacteria and the environment or the conditions. So an example could be a dried food that's being exposed to moisture, a hot food that's left out on the counter and is slowly decreasing in temperature, or not enough acid was added to a food and then it was processed and stored. The next phase is the log phase. The log phase is a period of rapid growth where the bacteria are doubling in number every 20 minutes and the environment or the conditions are ideal. So let's refer back to our previous examples. The dried food has now been exposed to enough moisture that the water activity of the food has changed and the bacteria can bind with the water molecules. The hot food dropped to a temperature of 72 degrees, and it's been at that temperature for a few hours now as it sits on the counter. And that temperature is ideal for the bacteria. And the bacteria in the improperly acidified food are thriving at a pH of 5. So I mentioned these different phase names, especially the log phase for those of you that are doing some type of food processing and you have to do a HACCP plan, and your HACCP plan has to show, 5-time log reduction. This is an important concept to understand if you're having to do those HACCP plans. The next phase is the stationary phase, and this is when bacteria growth stops or it stabilizes due to the bacteria using up all of the resources they need to grow, or because their growth changed the environment, so it's no longer their ideal environment. They're not dying, they're still present. And then last is that death phase. In the death phase, the environment or the conditions are no longer support the bacteria growth and they begin to die. So the bacteria, maybe they've run out of a food source. The oxygen level in the packaged environment has changed because of their own respiration. It doesn't mean that there's no longer a foodborne illness risk if the food is contaminated. The bacteria are still present on that contaminated food, and they could still make somebody sick when consumed. So again, the takeaway from this chart is that if as many of those 5 other factors are not controlled and enough time is given, that bacteria is going to grow at a very rapid rate. And depending on the food and where it's served or consumed, a large foodborne illness outbreak could occur. So again, really important to control as many of these 6 factors that you can. So for packaged or processed foods, follow the best buy dates. If you're preparing or serving foods and you get interrupted, put those cold foods in the refrigerator to keep them cold. Keep hot foods hot until you're able to return to the task. Or if you don't have a way of keeping them hot, cool them down and you'll have to reheat them then when you return to that task. So hand washing. We reviewed what pathogens need to grow and how your actions can impact their growth. But preventing the spread of pathogens is very important. So let's talk about hand washing. So who needs to wash their hands? All food handlers. You probably knew I was going to say that. So you can type it into the chat to share some ideas, some specific job types in a food business or at home for somebody that's handling food that would need to wash their hands. So just a few examples is, a food handler who is harvesting foods from a garden or an on-site farm, a food handler who is preparing foods, somebody that's decorating a food, such as cakes or cookies, someone who's packaging a food, maybe somebody's packaging up some dehydrated fruits, a food handler who is serving a food, somebody who is selling foods, and especially if money and packaging of a food are occurring at that same time, at time of sale. So I'll check the chat after this to see some of your other ideas as well. Okay, so what parts of the body are we referring to when we say hand washing? And you might be thinking, okay, she's losing it. It's obvious, it's in the name. Hand washing, we're washing our hands. And yes, you are right, we are hand washing. But hand washing also includes your wrists and the parts of your lower arms that are exposed, and also under your fingernails. So washing all of these areas is important because pathogens can hide in the cracks or the folds of our skin. So where you wash your hands matters. For those of you preparing foods in an inspected kitchen or a space that meets requirements for things like product of the farm, a designated hand sink is required. So a designated hand sink is a sink that is only used for hand washing, not for food preparation or produce cleaning or disposing of wastes. It's stocked with soap and paper towels. And posting hand washing signage is a way to remind everybody how to wash their hands and is required in many food businesses. Rick is sharing a link in the chat to the Minnesota Department of Health website that has many different hand washing signs that are free to print and download. And there's a few different options that are in multiple languages as well. If you're in a home kitchen preparing foods as a cottage food producer or just for your personal use, the kitchen sink would be your hand washing sink. A separate sink for other kitchen tasks like washing produce or dishes is not required. A few best practices that I would recommend for at home, especially if you are using your space for cottage food production, is to really prevent cross-contamination. And to do that, clean and sanitize your sink immediately after handling any raw meat, poultry, or fish. Clean and sanitize the sink before washing any produce in that sink. And when you're cleaning and sanitizing that area, pay special attention to the handles of the faucet and soap dispensers before beginning any food preparation. And then lastly, again, especially if you're using your home kitchen for cottage food sales, I recommend using paper towels to dry your hands and turn off the faucet rather than a cloth towel, because that eliminates the risk of contamination. Okay. So you've likely heard the phrase frequent hand washing when preparing or handling foods, but what does that mean? So always wash your hands before beginning to prepare foods, before packaging foods, before beginning a new task, and before putting on disposable gloves. Always wash your hands after using the toilet, handling the raw meat, poultry, fish, eggs, touching animals and pets, eating or drinking. That even includes like taste testing, smoking, vaping, or using chewing tobacco, sneezing or blowing your nose, touching your hair, your face, or your body, handling garbage, recycling, or compost, cleaning and sanitizing, using your phone or an electronic device, and shaking hands or hugging. So why is hand washing so important? So studies have shown that washing hands with non-antibacterial soap and warm water for 20 seconds can remove up to 92% of bacteria on hands. That's a lot. So two quick comments that I just want to make: that antibacterial, antimicrobial, or antiseptic soaps, they're not more effective than plain soap and water in these situations. There's some healthcare situations where those types of soaps need to be used, but for the purpose of our discussions, just a regular non-antibacterial soap is what can reduce up to 92% of bacteria. And then also a liquid soap from a dispenser is recommended because bar soaps can harbor bacteria on those surfaces, and soap dispensers can be routinely cleaned and sanitized. So finally, how do we wash our hands? We're going to watch just a short video from the Minnesota Department of Health, and then Rick is also going to share in the chat the link to their playlist that has this video in multiple languages. So the whole process should take 20 seconds. Wetting hands with warm running water, applying enough soap to cover all your surfaces while you're rubbing your palms together, your fingers interlaced, palms to palm, getting under those fingernails, and rotating back and forth along your palms, and again, fingertips to the palms, running warm water, and then turning off with a clean paper towel. So the whole process takes 20 seconds, and that's a pretty easy time commitment to have such a large impact on food safety. So while hand washing is very effective in removing pathogens, there is still the possibility of a small number of pathogens remaining on your hands. Remember, the hand washing can remove up to 92% of pathogens. So this is why preventing bare hand contact with foods that are ready to eat or do not require further cooking is important. So disposable gloves are commonly used for many tasks. Remember, you need to prevent cross-contamination by washing your hands before and putting on disposable gloves and changing your gloves between tasks. Safe use of disposable gloves can be ideal for plating or packaging foods. especially those that are delicate, cutting RTE or ready-to-eat foods, which can be anything from produce that'll be eaten raw or slicing cooked foods. I also included wearing disposable gloves when hand mixing raw meat, poultry, or fish, because that can act as a barrier to prevent anything from getting under your nails or in the grooves of your hands, which can be hard to remove during hand washing. And then I also included wearing disposable gloves when cutting produce or herbs for drying. While dehydrators can dry foods at temperatures of 160 degrees, some can function at lower temperatures. So if cross-contamination occurred, that temperature might not be high enough to kill any bacteria. And then utensils are also a good strategy. Just remember, prevent cross-contamination by using separate utensils for different tasks. So to wear gloves safely, again, you need to wash and dry your hands. You'll want to select, disposable gloves usually kind of come in like that package where you can easily grab near that opening or that wrist area. You want to grab there so you're not contaminating any of the other surfaces. Put on the first disposable glove without touching the other surfaces with your ungloved hands. And then inspect for tears or rips, and then put on the second glove. To remove gloves, grab by the wrist and pull down and over your finger. And this will turn the gloves inside out and kind of encase the next one inside it when you remove the second one. And then wash and dry your hands afterwards. Because you had so many good questions, I think I will skip the video that I had, but I'll include the link to watch in the chat. And this just demonstrates how to safely put on and take off disposable gloves to minimize contamination and that cross-contamination. I will just make a couple quick notes. When you're selecting disposable gloves for food handling, it's best to choose options that are latex free and do not contain a powder, as those may have an allergy risk. And additionally, colored disposable gloves can be useful, as rips are easier to see on your hands or if a piece was torn off into food. And then there's 3 types of disposable gloves that are good for food handling. These are vinyl, nitrile, or poly materials. Poly are lightweight, they have a looser fit, and they're good for basic food handling and packaging tasks. Poly disposable gloves are also typically at a lower cost than nitrile or vinyl disposable gloves. Vinyl gloves are very flexible, and then nitrile gloves are tougher, and they can hold up well against the animal fats, oils, acidic foods. And they're also chemical resistant, which means they won't break down if you're wearing them when you're cleaning and sanitizing. Yeah, I will share that link to the video. Okay. So, like I said, I'm happy to stay on to answer any of those other questions that we didn't get to. And if you have to leave, thank you, and I appreciate your time.